Alright, so one of the most common questions I get is what's the best setup for a certain budget? Like, what telescope and what eyepiece should I get if I only have $300, $500 and so on? Well, in today's video, I'll try to answer those questions by highlighting a few setups for 300, 500 and $1,000. So grab a hot cup of coffee, lay back, and let's get this video on the road. Hi, I'm Bogdan Damian, and welcome to BD Observatory. The first category we are going to take a look at is setups below $300, and it's probably most relevant for beginners. Even though $300 or roughly 270 euros doesn't seem that much to spend on a decent telescope and eyepiece, you would be surprised about what you can actually get for this money. So let's start with a telescope. At this price point, I wouldn't go for anything other than a small reflector telescope, like the 5-inch Skywatcher Heritage Flex Tube, for example. It's a small f5 tabletop Dobsonian telescope with a focal length of 650 millimeters and with a big enough light gathering capacity to allow you to observe some of the brightest DSO targets without a problem. The 130 millimeters of aperture will get you a maximum theoretical magnification of 260x under perfect seeing conditions, or more like 200x under normal seeing conditions, which is perfectly enough for planetary observations. You can get this telescope for roughly 230 euros or 260 US dollars. This means that there is still $40 left for us to spend on eyepieces. The 5-inch Skywatcher Heritage comes with two eyepieces out of the box, a 10 and a 25 mm Plösel. If we assume that this setup is indeed for someone who just started with astronomy, then planetary observations will most likely be the focus point for this setup, as planets are easier to find and observe. That is why out of the two eyepieces the telescope comes with, I would replace the 10 mm one with something better, like the 6 mm ultra-wide-angle gold line from SV Bony or TS Optics. This gold line eyepiece is quite a decent one. I got mine from TS Optics some 10 years ago, and I'm still using it today. With its 66 degrees apparent field of view, good contrast and brightness, this eyepiece will allow for very nice views of the moon and the planets, and it only cost you about $50. The included 25 mm eyepiece, while basic, is good enough for now and doesn't necessarily need upgrading until later on when you are more experienced. So adding these items together, we get a price of roughly 310 US dollars, which is a bit over our 300 US dollars spending limit, but that's still acceptable, seeing that the resulting setup is a decent all-rounder that will serve you well for at least a couple of years. Now, if you want to fully utilize the magnification capabilities of the 5-inch Skywatcher telescope from our example before, then you could also consider investing in a decent 2x bellow lens, like the 2x bellow from Teleview, which is currently sold for $130. This will double the focal length of your telescope, and the 6 mm gold line UVA eyepiece will act like a 3 mm one. But adding a bellow to our setup will make it cost way more than our budget of $300 allows, which is why I won't include it in this setup. You should keep this idea in mind though. Alright, let's see what we can get if we increase our budget to 500 US dollars or roughly 450 euros. Increasing the budget opens up a couple of options. We can either go again with a reflector telescope, or we can choose a refractor this time. If we were to go with the reflector, I would go with a similar telescope like in the previous example, only a bit bigger, like a 6-inch Dobsonian telescope, for example. Even though there are a few options available for this size, like the 150C from GSO or the XT6 from Orion or the classic Dob from Skywatcher, I would go with the latter simply because it comes with a 2-inch Crayford focuser. All the other options only feature a 1.25-inch focuser, limiting you considerably in your choice of eyepieces, especially the ones with long focal lengths that are suitable for deep sky observations. In terms of price, specs, and quality, there isn't a real difference between these telescopes. So for our setup, let's choose the one that offers the best future proofing, the 6-inch classic Dob from Skywatcher. It features an aperture of 150 mm and a focal length of 1200 mm, making this an f8 telescope that will cost roughly $400. The 6-inch wide aperture will allow for even more light to be captured when compared with the previous setup, making this telescope a decent option for deep sky observations as well. Even though it's a fully fledged solid tube Dobsonian telescope, it's still light and compact enough to be transported almost anywhere. Alright, spending $400 on this telescope will leave us with $100 to spend on eyepiece upgrades. This Skywatcher Dob comes with a 10 and 25 mm Plösel eyepiece in the box, but since these are very basic, I would upgrade both this time. For the short focal length option, I would go and get the 6 mm gold line I mentioned earlier for $50. This eyepiece combined with the 1200 mm focal length of the telescope will yield a magnification of 200x, which is plenty for planetary observations. With now only $50 left out of our $500 budget, I would either get the 20 mm ultra-wide angle gold line, which just like the 6 mm version is a very decent eyepiece that represents a considerable upgrade over the standard 25 mm eyepiece the telescope comes with. Or alternatively, spend a bit more and go over the planned budget and get the 32 mm 2-inch SWAN eyepiece from Omegon. It's a great eyepiece with a 70-degree wide apparent field of view, which is capable of offering bright and contrast-rich views of deep sky objects. Its long eye relief of 25 mm will also allow for a very comfortable viewing experience. Plus, it will let us fully utilize the 2-inch focuser the Skywatcher telescope comes with. So adding this all up, we either end up exactly at $500 for the whole setup with the 6-inch Dob, the 6 and 20 mm gold line eyepiece, or we exceed our budget by a bit and get the 32 mm SWAN eyepiece instead of the 20 mm gold line for a total of roughly $570. If a Dobsonian telescope is not your favorite, then you could get a refractor instead. Even though the aperture is a bit smaller, the lack of an obstruction inside the optical tube and quality lenses that are fully multi-coated will allow for sharp, bright and contrast-rich images of the night sky. A decent 4-inch achromatic refractor like the Star Travel EQ1 from Skywatcher, the AC-AZ from Omegon or the Astromaster from Celestron would be good choices here. All three offer the same level of quality, with the only two major differences being the focal length, 500 versus 660 mm, and the fact that the Skywatcher comes with an equatorial mount and the Omegon and Celestron don't. They come with an at-azimuth mount. Although both an EQ and AZ mounts have their pros and cons, in general, an equatorial mount will make it easier to navigate the night sky, since you only need to rotate the telescope on one axis in order to keep an object centered while following it across the sky. And this alone makes me lean towards the Skywatcher. So let's go with this telescope for our sub $500 setup. It features an aperture of 102 mm and a focal length of 500 mm, making it an f5 refractor. This being a telescope with an achromat design, its objective lens is made out of two elements that are fully multi-coated for optimal light transmission. The star travel also comes with a basic but decent 2-inch focuser and a red dot finder. As mentioned before, this telescope sits on top of a basic but good equatorial mount, the EQ1, with manual controls, so no go-to here. The legs of the mount are the same as for every other entry-level telescope from Skywatcher, which doesn't mean that they aren't good. In fact, I own a 4-inch Maxutov Cassegrain telescope that came with a very similar mount with identical legs, and I like it very much. It's steady and easy to operate whilst being light enough so that it can be transported anywhere. This telescope, including the mount, costs around $320, which leaves us with $180 to spend on eyepiece upgrades. And here I would go with the same 6mm ultra-wide gold line I mentioned before, but instead of upgrading the included 25mm eyepiece, I would get a decent Barlow instead. I'm thinking about a 2x Barlow, and this will allow us to achieve much higher magnification with this telescope. Specifically, I'm thinking about the 2x Barlow lens from Teleview, which is currently on sale for $130. Adding all these items up, we have $300 for the telescope, $50 for the eyepiece, and $130 for the Barlow lens, resulting in a total cost of round about $500, which is exactly what we wanted. Later, if you would like to upgrade the setup, you could get a good diagonal, either a mirror or a prism, like the ones from Teleview or Bother Planetarium. This will significantly improve your views of the night sky by making them brighter and sharper, whilst eliminating unwanted light reflections. Alright, now just for the fun of it, let's double the budget to $1,000 and let's see what we can get for this money. There are a couple of options to choose from. We either let ourselves succumb to the aperture fever and get a 10-inch Dobsonian telescope, thus putting a focus on deep sky observations, or we can choose a Cassegrain telescope, either an SET or a Mac, with the go-to functionality, which will be very well suited for planetary observations and astrophotography. If we were to go with the first option, then there are a few alternatives on the market from companies like Skywatcher, GSO, Apertura, Orion, and Omegon. Keep in mind here that Apertura and Omegon are both made by the same manufacturer, GSO, which is why all three telescopes are identical in terms of specs and quality. Likewise, both Skywatcher and Orion are made by Cinta, meaning that these telescopes are also identical in terms of specs and features. The real difference between all these telescopes lies mostly with the supplied accessories like extra eyepieces, type of finder scopes, type of focusers, collimation screws, and fans for cooling the primary mirrors. So out of these 5 telescopes, the most complete package, in my opinion, is offered by GSO with the deluxe version, by Omegon with the ProDob version, or Apertura. So I would build the setup around one of these. Depending on where you buy the telescope, it will cost you roughly $800 to $900. These telescopes come with an aperture of 250 millimeters and a focal length of 1250 millimeters, making them f5 Dobsonian telescopes that also feature a solid tube construction. Now, these are bulky and heavy and not that easy to move around. So this is definitely something to keep in mind. Besides a really nice ultra-wide eyepiece, you also get a decent Crayford focuser with a 10:1 reducer, collimation screws and a fan for the primary mirror. The only important thing missing is a decent short focal length eyepiece. And here I would like to go for the 6mm ultra-wide angle gold line I mentioned earlier, or for the more expensive but also much better 5mm Hyperion from Baader Planetarium. The Hyperion is one of my favorite eyepiece lineups because they offer bright, sharp, and a decently wide apparent field of view without costing a lot of money. With a generous eye relief of 20mm, the viewing experience is also very comfortable. The price for this eyepiece is roughly $150. Should the Omegon GSO or Apertura not be available in your region, it's okay. You can get the Skywatcher 250p or the Orion XT10 instead. Keep in mind that if you are to get one of these telescopes, you probably should also invest in a decent long focal length eyepiece to replace the basic one that's included in the box. Here, the 32mm 2-inch SWAN from Omegon mentioned earlier comes to mind. For the short focal length eyepiece, go with the same 6mm UVA from before. Regardless of which 10-inch W you decide to get, a budget of roughly $1,000 should be enough for a good setup that will enable you to observe the planets, the moon, and faint deep sky objects without a problem. But maybe a huge Dobsonian telescope isn't the right choice for you, and you are interested in something more compact and easy to transport. And maybe it should also have go-to capabilities to allow for easier navigation and astrophotography as well. Well, for $1,000, you could get a very good 5-inch Maksutov Cassegrain telescope with an easy-to-use go-to mount. Here I'm thinking about the 5-inch SkyMax from Skywatcher with an AZ GTI mount, or the Celestron Nexstar 127 SLT. Even though the aperture is only 127mm wide, this telescope design more than makes up for it in terms of image quality and versatility. The long focal length of 1500mm, combined with a precise and sharp corrector plate typical for Max, these telescopes will offer best-in-class contrast and brightness levels, rivaled maybe only by much more expensive apochromatic reflectors. Such a Maksutov Cassegrain telescope on a computerized mount, in my opinion, represents the perfect setup for visual planetary observations and astrophotography. Both the Celestron and the Skywatcher cost about the same, around $700, which leaves us with $300 to spend on better eyepieces and accessories. And here I would first upgrade the supplied mirror diagonal with a better option like the 1¼ inch prism diagonal from Baader Planetarium. This will improve contrast and brightness even further, and also eliminate unwanted internal reflections. This diagonal costs around $150 depending on where you buy it, which leaves us with another $150 for more upgrades. For this money, I would get a better short focal length eyepiece to improve planetary observations. Here I'm thinking about the Hyperion lineup I mentioned before. More specifically, I'm interested in the 8mm version, which costs, surprisingly, $150. Well, together with a prism diagonal and the 5-inch Mac, we have put together a very good setup focused on planetary observations and astrophotography. And all this for $1,000, which is what we set out to do. Alright, so these were a few examples of setups for different price ranges that, in my opinion, would strike a good balance between price and performance. This is by no means a complete and final list. It should rather be viewed like a guide for anyone looking to get a new setup with a fixed budget in mind. Also, please keep in mind that I mostly have access to the German market, which is why the mentioned prices might be different for you if you live in a different country. Anyway, let me know what you think about these choices. I'm very curious about that. Alright, this was it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. If you have questions or feedback, then please leave a comment and I will get back to you. Thanks for watching and catch you guys in the next video.